So as the recent unpleasantness draws to a conclusion, we're taking a look at the most important points in the American Civil War. And we're going to have a little discussion on how the war was won in the West. So we're out here at Fort Donelson discussing the war in the West. Now that peace has been concluded, I have General Grant with me to discuss one of the first victories out in the Western theater of the war and perhaps why the war was won in the West rather than the East.
That's an interesting way to place that. This is the first significant victory because we captured a full Confederate army here for the first time. None of the fighting in Virginia had borne any fruit. My first victory at Belmont up near Missouri was significant. It was a small victory, but it wasn't anything like capturing this kind of bastion that protects the whole of the Cumberland River. So our campaigns here in the West were designed to take these river forts out of commission because the rivers were the transportation system that would allow us to get inland into these states. And that's very well documented or portrayed because the Navy takes Fort Henry by itself, which is a cheaper, lower grade fort to begin with. But this stronger fort has to be invested by the Army because these Navy boats get nailed by a lucky shot where they're ineffective.
And so, these are heavy guns. I mean, these are formidable defenses. So the Confederates put a lot of emphasis on holding this position. Yeah.
So they're effective at not just hitting the boats, they're rendering the boats useless. They smashed a wheelhouse by a lucky shot. So then the ground troops have to take this. And this will allow us then to have an open door to the inner workings of Tennessee, because the next stop that I can see in my perception is on the Tennessee River, which the Cumberland becomes part of. And there are larger forts along the Tennessee River, which will get us to the Mississippi River, which gets us further down in the heart of the Confederacy, and their entire water transport network has to be destroyed. That heart of the Confederacy has to be torn apart by nicking away at these forts along the way.
So while gunboats just sailed up to Fort Henry, water pouring in, the guns were basically above the fort firing into it, untenable position. Yeah. Here we have heavy guns that actually hold back Foote's flotilla.
Yes.
So take us through the landward side of things.
Well, the three divisions we have, and we start this fight, we march in with two divisions. The troops that Halleck is sending me, there's Nebraska troops, there's Iowa troops for the first time these further western states are participating. I have enough to form a third division, and I give that over to Lew Wallace. So I have C.F. Smith, I have McClernand from Illinois, and I have Lew Wallace now with a force, and we're massed at about 40,000. So what the Confederates have most is maybe 27,000 all active, ready to go at any time, including cavalry. And that's not counting the guns of the fort. And with the Navy not being able to help, we do have to invest it from the land, and we nearly get to do that. But in the course of that assault that's going to break them, Simon Buckner, one of the Confederate generals, brings troops in that reinforce their line and stall us. But at that point, it's clear to them that no matter what, because we're going to bring ships back in, so they know the Navy will be coming back, and they see our greater number of forces, that they offer terms or they request terms. And this is a lot of firsts here. This is the first when I begin my cigar habit. And this is the first unconditional surrender, which gives me a new nickname based on my initials. For some reason, the press likes that. But it occurred to me that the rebels really don't deserve terms. They are insurrectionists. They have defied their oath to the old flag, and they get no terms, which I stated in the letter to Buckner, that there are no terms except an immediate and unconditional surrender.
And Buckner remains here while the others
leave.
Yes,
significant there, and a credit to him as a professional soldier. General Pillow, who I was with in Mexico, was very indistinguished, shall we say. General Floyd is more a politician than a general. They flee with a small number of forces. The Confederate cavalry commander, Nathan Bedford Forrest, who's a burr in our saddle the entire fight out here, he breaks through our lines with 700 troopers and skedaddles away. But Buckner said the surrendering men deserve to have a general to preside over things, to ensure for their best care, not knowing what kind of terms. But he had known me before in Mexico, and he presumes I'm more of a gentleman. But he's not happy with the terms. And that kind of causes a bit of a laugh among us, where he declares me ungentlemanly, and it's inglorious. And he has a few other choice words on it. When we take you down to the hotel where Buckner and I met to surrender, I'll tell you more about that little incident itself. But significant here is that we're building cohesion with the Army of the Tennessee. And keep in mind also, there's no corps establishment in the Western Army yet. The Eastern Army's just formed to that level. And as we progress to Shiloh, I have 5 divisions that are in the fight, and it becomes very untenable for one commander that you need a corps commander as that intermediate echelon. And that will be significant in the coordination of the fight. Here it's not so much. So something too, this fight here is our first large battle with a larger force. Shiloh becomes the development of that, and we build a larger army in embracing the corps system by the time we invest Vicksburg. Now, Vicksburg, there's no Battle of Vicksburg like so many of the papers like to write, but the actions leading up to the siege of Vicksburg, which is a 47-day siege, here there's a hint of a siege. There's just a ringing of the fort and the potential that we're going to smother you and choke you out, that it really isn't a proper, you can't really grace it by calling it such. Whereas later we expand that concept, we improve on it, we develop it. But the significant thing is capturing the full army here and rendering it ineffective for the course of things.
So there's a lot of firsts at Fort Donelson, including the first really effective use of combined arms.
Yes, that's probably the most significant part of this, is the combination of the Navy and the Army actually working together, not simply relying on the Navy to get us from one place to another and go and fight. And there you have to say Flag Officer Foote is the innovator that's willing to work with an Army commander, because until we work together, every Army commander has just assumed that the Navy is there at our beck and call. And I've treated him with reverence. I mean, he's been a midshipman since he was 12, so I look at it that he has been in service virtually 30 years of his life at this point, and he appreciates that I'm deferring to his seniority, that he's willing to say, well, you tell me what the Navy can do in support of what you're doing, because he knows what the Navy could do without us. And that becomes a valuable tool in our box that we learn how to develop and exploit through the next campaigns.
Now, the real key here, and I think the history of public opinion during the war is something worth discussing, but 2 things happen, is that this gives hope for the destruction of the Confederacy in the North. This actually makes victory possible for a lot of people.
True.
Especially when there are a lot of naysayers based on the performance in the East. But the other thing is that our friends, our Western friends in Washington, are able to lobby Lincoln, like Congressman Washburn.
You like to call Washburn my patron saint.
Yes.
Elihu Washburn is dragging my star to rise. He sees that I get commissioned as a colonel in Illinois. He sees with Lincoln, when Lincoln wants to promote more generals, I'm one of the 6 made a brigadier general. And out of this fight, I'm made the only person promoted out of this fight to major general, when General Halleck had recommended others. But it's Washburn in Lincoln's ear reminding him that I'm from Illinois, that Lincoln cues in on that and moves me forward. And Lincoln is ever grateful, because the Army in the East, with all the talk of on to Richmond and protect the capital and how that's going to be the whole war, we're winning out here in the West, and it's significant because of a full Army capture.
And there's a lot to talk about with the West versus East, and I'm sure we'll get to that a different day. But there is certainly a feeling among those in the northwestern states that there's a practicality, there's a frugality, there's just a different way of going about life in the West than there is in the East. And you can see it reflected in the uniform. You know, the practical Army hat and the lack of ostentatiousness.
The relaxed standards, perhaps.
Yes.
Right, because the men are more about the fighting.
And we could talk about, that goes to the Zachary Taylor versus the old Fuss and Feathers Winfield Scott, but I think there really is a
There's an intricate dance, a balance you have to find with volunteers,
okay.
and that's something with Taylor in Mexico. Taylor knew how to work the volunteers without beating them. General Scott preferred Army hard discipline to hammer them when they get out of line. But I could see from Taylor, he knew how to work them the same way you break a horse. If you come hard on a horse, it's not going to work for you. But if you treat it with a little bit of respect, you're going to get more out of it because it tends to want to work for you. And Westerners are like that. I'm born in Ohio, raised in Ohio, and I see that amongst the Iowa troops, the Illinois troops. There's a pluck about them where they'd rather just get to the business and not worry about how they look doing it.
And backing up the volunteers are those state regiments, are the troops called up by Lincoln that are not in the actual core professional army before the war.
True. With little training. Add to that also. There's no significant group training done. The men know how to fire. They're hunters. They're woodsmen in some regards. And they're a little more rugged because they live that existence where they're not on paved streets and in little towns.
Well, there's a
places.
grab bag. There's those frontiersmen, and then there are city folk. There are politicians, and there are all kinds of people that
they're looking for some kind of way to raise their station and not focus on the job at hand and realize that the job being successful will raise you. They'd rather just post themselves up and expect the things to happen because they're placed there.
Well, some people, but
There
there are
generals.
good volunteers as well as bad ones.
Well, I have in mind folks like McClernand in our
We could talk
forces.
about McClernand for a long time.
I don't want to talk about McClernand because I
We
prefer
shall
to
never
remain
talk
positive.
about him again,
Oh,
then.
we'll talk about him because he starts to become quite the burr in the saddle after a while too.
So, anything else to add about Fort Donelson? Now that we're here.
Well, we're going to head over to the hotel and we'll talk about the things there. The fort itself, I never once think we're not going to win, and you know that from the beginning. Every engagement we go into, my expectation is I have the vision towards the end that it will result in a victory, and I think everything that's successful is begun with the end in mind, and you have to get to that. You have to have the confidence, the innate confidence we're going to get to that, and that determination then percolates down through your leadership.
So, it's also how much time is it going to take? Is it going to be over in a day, or is it going to take a month to invest
And there you go.
this place?
That's the public sentiment part of it, because the people, as far as politicians are concerned, the people are demanding this be over quickly. They expected the war to be a month, a 3-week exhibition of some sort, and it's over. And those of us doing the fighting realize this is not going to end quickly. In fact, I regret that in some of my letters home to Julia. In the beginning, I kind of went along with that believed it would only be a few significant strikes and they would come to terms with us. And the resilience, and Sherman likes to remind me of that all the time, that the resilience of the Southerners is beyond endurance sometimes, the belief of how they can just keep going. And we encountered that here.
So, where else are we going to look today?
Well, like I say, we're going to go into the town of Dover. There's a hotel down on the landing, and that's where Buckner and I agreed to meet to talk to terms over breakfast. And we're going to head down to Shiloh. We're going to talk about the significance there, and I will candidly admit some of the things I probably could have done better now that I have some hindsight. And fully intending to get through Corinth, which was our objective when we were stopped at Shiloh. And we're going to head through down to Vicksburg, follow the crossing of the river and the march through Raymond to Jackson and eventually into Vicksburg itself before we head to Chattanooga. The significance there is also important, and we'll get to that too. And like Rawlins says, the war is won in the West, and we're here to prove that by coming back and reviewing these things.
We're here about a half mile from Fort Donelson at the Dover Hotel, the site of the surrender. Tell me about how this is different from any of the surrenders or aftermath of the engagements of any of the battles during the American Civil War. How is unconditional surrender important to winning war in the West?
It's somewhat self-descriptive that most surrenders, there are terms agreed to. You think back to the Revolution, the British were allowed to march out with all their arms and go back to their ships and go home safely. And in every battle to this point, the losing army remains intact and simply leaves the field. There's no surrender of that army. Here, we completely broke this army. 13,000 went north to prison because they wouldn't accept that they had been beaten in the first place. Where the paroles later with the unconditional surrenders, the men understood and they accepted the fact that they had been beaten. But here, it's clear that this is like taking a piece off the chessboard, that it will not be back on the board again. And it's the first time we actually show that we're serious, that we're eliminating your army. We're not just simply moving you around, which goes to the places warfare that people like Halleck want to pursue, where it's important to get a place and not destroy the army in that place. Not the doctrine we discuss and we develop, that if we destroy the army, the places will come because there's no army, anywhere near to protect it.
And they didn't come off as very chivalrous terms, were they?
Not at all. Buckner was quite reluctant to accept that. He had said in his reply, in his acceptance, although it begrudgingly, found the terms disingenuous and ungentlemanly. And when we spoke about it personally, he comes around in the face-to-face meeting where he understands it's not him, it's not directed at him. And I approach that and say that I believe that General Pillow had been in command of the army. So the terms were more directed at someone of that level. And had I known Buckner was in charge, I would have made the terms a little more genteel in some regard. But the intent is clear. Your army is done fighting, and I'm removing your army from this point.
So where are we headed from here?
Well, I think we're going to pursue what would come next in the evolution of things, is directing the army towards the rail junction in Mississippi at Corinth, where there are two railroads that intersect at perpendicular angles, which is a major supply point that feeds into Tennessee. And what we'll find is we don't reach Corinth before we encounter rebel forces at the small area of Shiloh near Savannah, Tennessee. So we'll be heading there next.
All right, well, let's keep seeing how the war was won out west.